If you've ever traveled to a foreign country, then you may have experienced the manipulative pricing schemes that many people use to take advantage of customers who aren't familiar with the way things work in that country. In many places, it's common practice to charge tourists up to 10 times the price that a local would pay for the same products or services, especially if the tourists come from North American or European countries. Here's an example of what I'm talking about.
If you're an American traveling in a foreign country, you need to be so careful when they bring you your check at a restaurant. They will overcharge the shit out of you if they can. It has happened to me so many times, and it just happened tonight. I ordered an appetizer, an entree, and a side, and the appetizer never came, only the entree and the side did. And then when I get the check, the first thing I notice is that the appetizer was still on there. So I point that out, she goes and fixes the check, and then she comes back. The second thing I notice is that the entree, it was $12 on the menu, but she charged me $14.95 on the check. And so I was like, I know this is overpriced. And she was like, no, that's correct. And I said, please bring the menu over. And then I pointed at the $12 on the menu because, like, what the fuck? So she goes and fixes it, then comes back like sulking, like slaps the check on the table, doesn't say good night to me or anything. I just am not exaggerating at all when I say this has happened to me so many times. I will never forget the time in Peru when this guy was helping me call a cab at the airport. And the cab driver told the guy that was helping me it was going to be $7, but he said it in Spanish. He was like, siete. And then when I asked the cab driver directly, he told me $10 in English. And so I was like, bitch, I know how to count to 10 in Spanish. I literally just heard you say $7 to him. Like, I'm paying 7. You just have to be careful because if you're not paying attention, like, they will fuck you over. It's happened to me so many times.
So, this guy describes the all too common experience of many Americans traveling abroad. He goes into a restaurant, receives poor service, and then the staff lies to him about the price of the food, charging him for an item he never received and overcharging him for the ones he did receive, thinking that he wouldn't notice. He then tells another story about catching a taxi in Peru and literally hearing the guy quote one price in Spanish and another in English. Apparently, people accept this as common practice to such a degree that when they get called out on it, they act as if the person demanding justice is the one who's being unreasonable. Several countries around the world have been known to practice these dual pricing schemes, where foreigners or tourists are charged higher prices than locals, most often, but not exclusively, in the tourism sector. Countries such as Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Egypt, India, amongst many others, have all been reported to engage in this dual pricing system on some level, often claiming that foreign visitors make more money and have a stronger currency, and therefore should pay higher prices and help maintain tourist infrastructure. And we could soon see the country of Japan being added to this list.
It just keeps getting worse for Japan. It finally happened. The yen just hit a 38-year low record against the US dollar. And this is horrible for Japanese and foreigners living and making money inside of Japan, because the price of basic necessities and imports has increased, while salaries in Japan stay pretty much the same. And even though it might sound like a dream for tourists heading to Japan right now, because their money is worth more so everything looks very cheap, but that could be changing very soon. In response to the messed up exchange rate, some politicians have been proposing having two-tier paid system. For example, a ticket to Himeji Castle costs around $7, but the mayor is looking to raise the price for foreigners to $30 and lowering it to $5 for residents. That's 3 times more than when the yen was stronger. And it doesn't stop there, because soon you might be paying more for booking hotels, eating food at restaurants, and who knows, foreigners might even get charged to enter places that are usually free. I personally agree with having 2 paid tier systems like most countries do, but instead of having foreigners pay a crazy amount of money, just give residents a bit of discount. Because if you make things crazy expensive, most tourists will just end up choosing a cheaper destination. But what do you guys think?
Alright, let me summarize that video really quickly just in case it was hard to follow. This guy is saying that the Japanese yen, or currency, has hit a 38-year low against the US dollar. Now, a simple way of saying that is the value of Japanese money in comparison to the US dollar is the lowest it has been in 38 years. And this negatively affects Japanese residents and foreigners living in Japan, because the prices of basic necessities and imported products has increased. Although the salaries have basically stayed the same, they've remained stagnant, which is happening in many countries. Now, while this situation does seem beneficial to foreigners who want to travel to Japan, it really might not be that way for a long time, because politicians are suggesting this dual pricing system, the 2-tier pricing system for various services and tourist attractions. And then he gave the example about Himeji Castle, where the tickets right now are about $7, but in the future, they could be $30 for all tourists and just $5 for Japanese citizens. And it may not stop there. You may find yourself paying 2 to 10 times the normal price for hotels or restaurants or taxis or other tourist attractions, including the ones that have been free up to this point. And so then the person who made the video goes on to say that he agrees with this two-tier pricing system, but instead of charging tourists a ridiculously high price, just give the locals a discount. And I gotta be honest, when I started working on this episode, I was gonna just rant emotionally about what I think of this two-tier system and this strange form of discrimination. But I wanted to take a more measured approach and be a bit more fair because I know that there are strong supporting and opposing arguments for this kind of thing. So what I did instead was I had a conversation with ChatGPT trying to steel man the supporting arguments for this type of thing. And when I say steel man, I'm trying to make the opposing argument, the argument that I disagree with, I'm trying to make it as strong as I possibly can in order to have a fair debate as opposed to just shitting all over people who disagree with me. So, with that being said, I'm now going to read you the conversation that I had with ChatGPT and then give you my honest thoughts. So I asked ChatGPT, what is the justification for countries like Thailand having a dual pricing system where Thai people pay one price and all foreigners must pay a higher price? And ChatGPT responds by saying, Thailand's dual pricing system, where locals pay one price and foreigners pay a higher price, can be justified by several factors. And so then ChatGPT lists out the factors 1 to 6, including economic disparity, subsidizing local cost, national revenue, local engagement, market segmentation. So I'm just going to read it from start to finish for a better listening experience. So number 1, foreigners, particularly tourists from wealthier countries, generally have a higher purchasing power compared to local residents, meaning their currency tends to be worth more and therefore they can buy more things at higher prices. Charging higher prices to tourists helps to balance this economic disparity or inequality. The revenue generated from higher prices paid by foreigners can subsidize the costs for local residents. This allows locals to afford cultural sites, national parks, and services that might otherwise be too expensive. Tourism is a significant revenue source for many countries. Higher charges for tourists can boost national revenue, which can then be used for broader developmental goals, including healthcare, education, and social services benefiting the entire population. Lower prices for locals can encourage them to visit and engage with their own cultural and natural heritage. This can foster national pride and awareness of conservation efforts. By ensuring that those who can afford to pay more do so, it allows for a more equitable distribution of resources. This means that public resources and attractions can be maintained without disproportionately burdening the local population. Differentiating prices based on nationality allows for effective market segmentation. Tourists might be willing to pay more for unique experiences, while locals might need more affordable access to the same services. While this system can seem unfair to some, it's a way for Thailand and countries like it to manage their resources and economic needs effectively. So then I asked ChatGPT a different question. I really wanted to test this logic because I'm having a hard time accepting it. So I asked ChatGPT, what if the same logic were applied to something like skin color and not nationality? ChatGPT responds with the following. Applying the same logic of dual pricing based on skin color rather than nationality would be ethically and socially problematic. Here's why. Pricing based on skin color is inherently discriminatory and would perpetuate racial inequality and racism. It would treat individuals differently based solely on their physical appearance, which is both unjust and morally wrong. Such a practice would violate fundamental human rights principles, including equality and non-discrimination, as enshrined in various international human rights conventions and laws. Implementing pricing based on skin color would likely lead to social unrest, resentment, and division. It would harm social cohesion and foster an environment of mistrust and conflict. In many countries, discrimination based on skin color is illegal. Implementing such a policy would likely result in legal challenges and penalties. Ethical principles demand that all people are treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their skin color. Pricing based on such a characteristic would be a clear violation of these ethical standards. In contrast, dual pricing based on nationality can be justified by economic and practical considerations, as previously mentioned. It's often viewed as a way to manage resources and economic disparities rather than as an inherent characteristic that a person cannot change. Like nationality, ChatGPT? Anyway, it says, however, even dual pricing based on nationality can be controversial and is subject to debate regarding fairness and ethics. I want to repeat that last thing. It is often viewed as a way to manage resources and economic disparities rather than as an inherent characteristic that a person cannot change. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but if I want to become Japanese tomorrow, the government's not going to let me do that. I can't just say I'm Japanese and therefore be treated. But anyway, let's move on. I'm going to save my thoughts for the end of this episode. I then asked ChatGPT, how do you see the dual pricing from a moral standpoint as opposed to an economic one? And it says the following. From a moral standpoint, dual pricing can be seen from multiple perspectives, each with its own ethical implications. Morally, dual pricing can be defended on the grounds of equity rather than equality. Equity involves fairness by taking into account different circumstances and abilities to pay. Since tourists often have higher disposable incomes, charging them more can be seen as a fair way to distribute costs and benefits more equitably, supporting those who may not have the same financial means. If the additional revenue from higher foreign prices directly supports cultural preservation, environmental conservation, and community development, it can be seen as a morally justifiable practice. It aligns with the ethical principle of beneficence, which involves actions that promote the well-being of others. From a utilitarian viewpoint, which focuses on the greatest good for the greatest number of people, dual pricing can be justified if it leads to overall societal benefits, such as improved infrastructure, better services for locals, and enhanced preservation of natural and cultural heritage. On the other hand, dual pricing can be viewed as exploitative if it's perceived that tourists are being unfairly charged simply because they are foreign. This could be seen as taking advantage of visitors, which might violate principles of fairness and non-discrimination. The morality of dual pricing also depends on transparency and how it is perceived by those affected. If tourists understand that the higher prices they pay contribute to positive outcomes for the local community and environment, they might view it as fair and acceptable. However, if the rationale behind dual pricing is not clearly communicated, or if the funds or money is mismanaged, it can lead to perceptions of unfairness and mistrust. Now, ethically, it's important to respect individuals regardless of their nationality. Dual pricing that discriminates based solely on nationality without a clear, justifiable reason may conflict with the principle of respect for persons, which emphasizes treating all individuals with equal dignity and consideration. Now, some might argue that there is a moral obligation for wealthier individuals or tourists from more affluent countries to assist in the development and preservation of less economically developed regions. Dual pricing can be seen as a practical implementation of this moral duty, helping to redistribute wealth in a way that supports those in need. In summary, the moral evaluation of dual pricing involves balancing principles of equity, fairness, respect, and transparency. While it can be morally justifiable under certain conditions, it requires careful implementation and clear communication to ensure it aligns with ethical standards and is perceived as fair by all parties involved. So then I asked ChatGPT another question. I asked, what do you think the potential effects of this dual pricing will be once tourists understand that they're being forced to pay more, specifically in situations where the only justification is that they're of a different nationality? I'm talking about private businesses like restaurants, hotels, bars, taxis, etc. ChatGPT responds with the following. The potential effects of dual pricing on tourist perceptions and behaviors, particularly in private businesses like restaurants, hotels, bars, and taxis, can be significant. Here are some potential consequences. Once tourists realize they're being charged more solely because of their nationality, it can lead to feelings of resentment and dissatisfaction. This negative perception can tarnish their overall experience and view of the country. Dual pricing can erode trust between tourists and local businesses. Tourists may feel exploited and less inclined to return to the same establishments or recommend them to others. This loss of trust can have long-term repercussions on customer loyalty. Dissatisfied tourists are likely to share their experiences through online reviews and social media, potentially deterring future visitors. Negative reviews can harm the reputation of businesses and, by extension, the tourism industry in that country. If tourists feel they're being overcharged, they might cut back on their spending, seeking out businesses that do not practice dual pricing or opting for cheaper alternatives. This can result in lower overall revenue for local businesses. Dual pricing based solely on nationality can be perceived as unfair and discriminatory. This perception can lead to broader criticisms of the country's treatment of foreigners, affecting its image as a tourist destination. The awareness of dual pricing might drive tourists to seek out businesses that offer fair pricing to everyone. This can encourage competition among businesses to attract customers by providing transparent and equal pricing. In some cases, dual pricing can lead to legal challenges or calls for regulatory changes, especially if it's perceived as a form of discrimination. This can create legal and ethical pressures on businesses to change their pricing policies. Tourists who feel unfairly treated are less likely to return to the destination. Repeat tourism is a valuable source of income for many tourist destinations, and losing repeat visitors can have a negative impact on the local economy. In a globalized world with many travel options, tourists might choose alternative destinations where they feel they are treated more fairly. And this shift can result in a decline in tourist numbers for destinations known for dual pricing practices. The practice of dual pricing can also create cultural and social tensions between locals and tourists. Tourists may feel alienated and unwelcome, which can impact the overall atmosphere and dynamics between visitors and residents. In conclusion, while dual pricing might provide short-term economic benefits to businesses, it can have significant long-term negative effects on tourist satisfaction, business reputation, and the overall attractiveness of the destination. Transparency, fairness, and clear communication about pricing policies are crucial to maintaining positive relations with tourists and ensuring sustainable tourism development. Now, that's the end of my conversation with ChatGPT. Hopefully, the software did a good job of laying out all the reasons that countries should engage in this dual pricing scheme, because I'm sure many of you listening support this kind of thing. You might be from a country where this is common practice. But now I'd like to tell you what I think. It's said that charging foreigners to visit government-funded locations will offset the cost of over-tourism and help pay for the maintenance that comes from it, which I can understand to a certain extent. Foreign tourists don't pay the taxes that help maintain these public facilities and therefore should pay more when using them. But it also must be said that we have no idea where all of that money actually goes. I'd like to think that the majority of people listening to this would say that their government is constantly misusing tax money on everything except public services that are meant to make people's lives better. So even this claim seems to be more of a political one than a factual one, although I do acknowledge that that's debatable. But as far as I can tell, the only justification for this kind of discrimination is that people from other countries might make more money and have stronger currency than the locals who were born and raised there. But if that were the case, wouldn't there be a different price for literally every nationality on the planet? Shouldn't Americans and Mexicans get charged different prices due to their drastically different currency exchange rates? What about the Spanish and Sudanese, or the French and Brazilians? The claim that dual pricing is about equity sounds like nonsense to me, because true equity is about equal opportunity, not equal outcome. And you see this with things like affirmative action. And just in case you don't know, affirmative action, sometimes referred to as reservations or alternative access or positive discrimination, refers to a set of policies and practices within a government or organization seeking to benefit marginalized groups, groups that have historically been oppressed or discriminated against or excluded or marginalized from society. For example, due to the fact that Black Americans have historically been discriminated against, oppressed, and continually felt the effects of slavery, a school like Harvard University might try to make amends or make up for this by guaranteeing 100 seats at Harvard Business School specifically for Black people. Because if their ancestors hadn't been enslaved and robbed of their futures, then they would have been able to educate their people and end up at Harvard University just like all of the other students of other races whose ancestors didn't suffer the same treatment. So the idea is that no matter how qualified or unqualified you are to be at this school, you're guaranteed a spot solely because you are Black. In fact, even if a student of a different race is drastically more qualified than you and he worked his ass off to get accepted into the school, we're going to take his spot and give it to you. Again, just because you're Black and he's not. And this is not equity. This is simply reverse racism, disguised as an attempt to address the symptoms of a problem rather than fixing the problem itself. True equity would be giving every citizen access to high-quality education regardless of where they live, how much money their family has, what they look like, or where their ancestors come from. It would be giving every child an equal opportunity to succeed, and then letting things play out based on the actions that each individual chose to take, rather than trying to skip over that and giving anyone a seat at Harvard Business School regardless of how much effort they've made to get there. Or in other words, rather than making sure everyone has the same outcome. So I've yet to hear a logically sound argument that supports the exploitation of foreigners in the private sector. It seems to me that this type of discrimination, like most discrimination, is motivated by negative emotions like envy, hatred, and or greed. It's so common to hear things like, oh, these Americans, these Canadians, these Europeans are coming here and spending their dollars and their euros and their pounds, making everything more expensive. Our country is cheap for them, so they can eat at the nicest restaurants, buy the nicest cars and motorcycles, rent the nicest condos, date the finest women, and live like kings while we are still struggling to pay rent. And for that reason, we're going to tax them. And not only that, we're not going to tell them about this tax. We're just going to take advantage of the fact that they don't know how things work here. As the young man said in the first video clip I played, getting overcharged at local restaurants is a common occurrence when you're a Western traveler. Here in Thailand, you go to some restaurants, and on one side of the menu, everything is written in Thai script with Thai numerals, because originally they didn't use Roman numerals like most countries do today. So if you're not familiar with it, you can't read the letters or the numbers on the menu. And on the other side, everything is written in English with Roman numerals. And now that I can read Thai script and numerals, I can clearly see the same plate of food is listed at 60 baht in Thai and 200 baht in English. Can someone explain to me how this is morally justifiable? Can someone explain to me how a Western tourist ordering a meal at a restaurant is somehow more of an economic burden on the business? How is it more expensive or burdensome to serve an American person than it is a Thai person? How is transporting an American from the airport to the hotel more of an economic or social burden than taking a Thai person from the airport to the hotel? Am I supposed to believe that if the same thing happened in the United States of America, that we wouldn't be called greedy, racist, first world pigs? And another thing, can someone explain to me how the presence of foreigners is making things more expensive? If a group of Americans come to Thailand and start spending money, or in other words, stimulating the fucking economy, how does that inherently increase the price of things? Because the last time I checked, a private business is free to set its own prices. So maybe, just maybe, the people complaining about this type of thing should look at their own countrymen. Because it's not the American spending dollars who makes things more expensive. It's the local who realizes that he can make more money by charging higher prices that only Americans can pay. How is that the Americans' fault? We don't set the price, we just pay it. So if you want to talk about equity, then talk to the locals who are choosing profits over their own people. It just seems to me that people are only okay with this kind of thing when they are the ones taking advantage of others, but not when others are taking advantage of them. I only hear support for this type of discrimination from people who are either currently benefiting from it or people who don't know what it's like to spend their entire lives working for something only to have it taken from them because their ancestors were on the wrong side of history, or they come from a family of successful people, or because someone, somewhere, has it worse than they do. And like I said, I wanted to produce this episode in the most fair way possible. So I went on Reddit and other sites reading opinions and comments from other people. And one of the comments I saw stood out to me, and I saw it time and time again. So I'm going to read it to you now. This person says, consider the fact that the average Thai person has about 1/10 or 10% of the income of the average Western tourist. When you think about it that way, charging the tourist actually makes more sense. Honestly, you paid thousands to get there, so is a couple more bucks going to kill you? Let me say that in a different way just in case it wasn't clear. This person is saying, consider the fact that the average Thai citizen makes 10% of what the average American makes, just as an example. When you think about it that way, charging the American more makes sense. And he says, honestly, you paid thousands of dollars to get there. You paid thousands for the plane ticket, for the hotel, for the taxis, and everything else. You already have thousands to spend. So is spending a couple more dollars really going to kill you? Stop complaining. Pay the extra money. That's really what's being communicated. And what I want you guys to understand is that this, at least where I'm from, is what we call pocket watching. Now, pocket watching is, I guess you could call it a slang term that refers to the act of observing and commenting on how someone else manages or spends their money. It often carries a negative connotation, suggesting nosiness or envy, as it involves scrutinizing or criticizing others' financial decisions or wealth. This behavior is generally viewed as intrusive and inappropriate, as it involves judging or speculating about someone's financial status without their consent. And this, my friends, is only done by the type of people I just described, the type of people who are either benefiting from it, or people who don't know what it's like to spend their lives working for something only to have it taken from them because their ancestors were on the wrong side of history, or because they come from a family of successful people, or because someone, somewhere in the world, has it worse than they do. You have more money than I do. I'm poor and you're rich, and therefore I deserve your money more than you do. I deserve to decide what you do with your money more than you deserve to do that. I don't think some people realize how far this social justice game can really go. Because if the idea is that people who might have it better than others should work and pay and or suffer more, then literally everyone would eventually find themselves being discriminated against for things they can't control. Should fat and ugly women be given the best movie roles because it's easier for beautiful women to get into the movie industry? You're already beautiful. Would it kill you to give the fat and ugly girls a chance? Stop complaining. Or should old people have to pay more for groceries than young people? Consider the fact that older adults might have more savings and higher income than younger people. When you think about it that way, charging older adults more for groceries makes sense. They already have more financial stability, so a few extra dollars for food won't kill them. Or maybe white people. Should they have to pay more than black and brown people? Because generally speaking, North American and European white people make more money than black and brown people who come from the same countries. And when you think about it that way, charging white people makes more sense. They've already benefited from hundreds of years of slavery and racial discrimination, so paying a few extra dollars won't hurt them. Stop complaining. The problem with this way of thinking is that it only takes immutable identity traits into account, or in other words, things that one has no control over and cannot change about oneself. And literally nothing else. It's taking nothing else into consideration. It's a logic that depends entirely on assumptions and not facts. Also, if the justification is that people who make more money should pay more for the same products and services because that's fair, then why don't rich people pay more than poor people for all products and services? According to the logic I've just described, a millionaire should be paying much more for a cheeseburger than someone who's making $1,000 a month, regardless of their nationality, right? One could argue that tall people should pay more for concerts because it's easier for them to see the show than it is for short people. Or fat people should pay more for plane tickets because they're putting more weight on the plane. Or Brazil and Germany should start the World Cup with a negative goal difference because they have too many good players and they've won the competition too many times. This is the logic that I'm being asked to accept, and I just can't do it. I saw another comment on Reddit about the same topic. This person says, I see this situation and this dual pricing more as a discount for the locals to encourage them to visit rather than a higher price or a fee for tourists. Because if they charge the tourist price to everyone, it would only be tourists and no locals visiting these places. If they charge the lower price to everyone, it would be overrun and probably underfunded. And so another person commented on that and says, this is exactly right. It's common at major sites in third world countries all over the world, from Angkor Wat to Machu Picchu to Taj Mahal. You just can't deny access to a national treasure to the local people. And somebody commented on that and says, most places that charge higher prices to foreigners already have zero locals visiting these places. What about street food stalls that charge 3 times the price for foreign people? So just in case that wasn't clear, this person is opposing this argument by saying, you're saying that they charge lower prices to foreigners higher prices to foreigners and lower prices to locals because if they didn't do that, then none of the locals would visit these places. And this person opposes that argument by saying, yeah, but locals already don't visit these places. And then he mentions private businesses, street food stalls, restaurants, taxi drivers, etc. What about them charging 3 to 10 times the price to foreigners? And somebody under that comments and says, if these businesses could charge the locals more, then they would. It's never about race or nationality. It's about making money from anyone who's willing to pay. I'm going to say that again. If these businesses could charge locals more, then they would. It's not about nationality or race. It's simply about making money from anyone who's willing to pay. This is the justification for exploiting the ignorance of foreigners who visit a country. It's just about making money from anyone who's willing to pay. But if we're supposed to use this type of logic, couldn't we make the same argument for the greedy billionaires who are just making money from anyone who's willing to pay? Or the corrupt politicians just making money from anyone who's willing to pay, polluting our rivers, trashing the environment, leaving plastic in the oceans, polluting the air, fucking over the local population in the name of higher profits? Aren't they also just making money from anyone who's willing to pay? Again, I totally understand this dual pricing scheme in the public sector, national parks and monuments, public museums, anything funded with tax dollars. But that's not the only place you find dual pricing. It's private businesses who are greedily and sneakily overcharging foreigners for the simple reason that they can make more profit in doing so. And I think ultimately they're shooting themselves in the foot. Because there's no way I'm eating at a restaurant once I realize that I'm being charged 2 to 10 times the price that a local would pay simply because I'm a foreigner. There's no way I'm taking my family to a country where I know I'm going to be exploited for the simple fact that we're from a country that's perceived to be rich. There's no way I'm going to think of a group of people as good when I know that they're just looking for ways to profit from my ignorance. And it has nothing to do with the money. It's about what's right and what's wrong. and how so many people's definition of these words is dependent on who is taking the action and not the action itself. And although there will always be more socialist minded people who don't mind being overcharged and will continue to pay the higher price, I struggle to make sense of the idea that a country dependent on tourism would punish the very people who are keeping its economy from collapsing. Pushing your economic problems onto foreigners is just a bad idea, because it's not a foreigner's fault that a country's economy is totally dependent on tourism. It's not a foreigner's fault that a country doesn't produce anything that can be exported for profit. It's not a foreigner's fault that the government is corrupt and stealing money from its citizens and making shady deals with billion-dollar corporations. That is not a foreigner's fault. So I don't see any logical justification for punishing foreigners for crimes they never committed.